Welcome and good evening, and what a pleasure it is to speak to you all tonight. What a great joy to share our interest in Macquarie together. And if I do say so myself, I'm very pleased indeed to speak about this particular aspect of Macquarie and his character and his interests and his responsibilities, because I think it's, in a sense, very logical for us to talk about Macquarie in Australia and what he did here. But I'm sure you'll agree with me that by the end of what I say to you tonight, you'll have an appreciation of how what he did here fed into broader currents in his life that were there from childhood, and they were there right through until the day he died, which was sadly too short. Major General Lachlan Macquarie lived from 1761 to 1824. He was Governor of New South Wales between 1810 and 1821, so more than a decade. And he was an ambitious man with considerable talent. He spent a lifetime striving for advancement in his military career, and he was suitably conscious of the importance of displaying success in a material way. Demonstrations of high rank on uniforms, ownership of land, and displays of wealth all played a part in his advertisement of the advancements made by him through his life. However, there was something in his life he valued beyond any of this, and it was a thing that could not be bought with money or achieved through hard work. Macquarie was devoted to his clan, to his chief, and to his identity as a Scottish Highland gentleman. In fact, more than most things, he worked very hard through his life to make himself a Scottish Highland gentleman and to prove to the world that he had achieved that status. Now, that all sounds a bit odd in terms of Macquarie the egalitarian, in terms of Macquarie the person who gave others opportunity, but these things are not irreconcilable, and I want to argue that they're one and the same in terms of their motivation and origin point. So let me try and prove that to you tonight. Lachlan Macquarie's father is often described as a carpenter. He was too poor even to manage independently on his small farmsteading in Mull. He had to share it with a few other people who were either family or codependents. This might be true that he was a carpenter, but young Lachlan received an education that was on par with that given to the sons of his chief and his neighbour on the small island of Ulva. So part of the story I'm telling you tonight is about Lachlan growing up in tandem, in parallel, with another story that we don't know so much about. And that story relates to the gentleman you're seeing here, who was the 16th and last chief of the Macquaries. And so their lives were intimately connected. Even when Lachlan was here governing New South Wales, he had an intimate knowledge and connection with the man you're looking at here as his clan chief. Our young Macquarie was also an acknowledged cadet of the chiefly line of the Macquaries. Later in life, his chief, who was also called Lachlan Macquarie, but Lachlan Macquarie of Ulva, viewed him as a most promising member of the family and maintained a correspondence with him. It is true that we will never know exactly where our Lachlan was positioned in this family. Basically, his birth was too obscure to know that. One suggestion is that his father belonged to a cadet branch of the Macquaries of Almaig. But in any case, our Lachlan was the grandson of a Macquarie of Ulva chief through his mother, Margaret, who was a daughter of Maclean of Lochboy. Significantly, from the point of view of this paper, Lachlan's relationship to his chief was never quite close enough for him to support any kind of claim to chiefship of the Macquarie clan. So that was never part of Lachlan's strategy for any future life success. A man of such energy and ambition as our Lachlan Macquarie would undoubtedly have made a claim on that august position had he been sufficiently close in blood. So that's a pretty important pointer in itself about where Lachlan sat in his family and knew that he sat in his family. The Macquaries were an ancient clan. They were long associated with the Isle of Ulva, and they were enmeshed by marriage into a neighbourhood bloodline network with the Macleans and the Campbells. So with this kind of history, it makes sense that our young Lachlan Macquarie would want to stamp his early career success in the army, and he was undoubtedly a successful officer in the British Army with signs of gentlemanly status, understood and displayed by all those people around him at the time. Remember, we're in the era of Jane Austen, we're in the era of officers, we're in the era of landed gentry. People know how to show signs that they belong to those groups. Lachlan was a Highland gentleman from an ancient family, irrespective of his father's circumstances, which were irrelevant, in fact, to the context of Highland chiefship. However, Lachlan Macquarie had no clear notion of what his coat of arms might be, for instance. And we look at, charts and signs of a Scottish clan identity, and the coat of arms is always there with the name and the tartan. That's a very modern concept. We can be sure that Lachlan did not, in fact, use any kind of coat of arms. And I'm mentioning this because it's kind of the litmus test of gentlemanly status. If you have aspirations or pretensions to belong to the gentlemanly class, you've got a coat of arms and you use it. Well, he didn't until at least the time of his marriage to Jane Jarvis. Now, both of her parents were armigerous. That means they were coat of arms using and possessing families. And she came from Antigua. They had made money in the West Indies, but they'd made all of this good by using coats of arms and having that acknowledged by the right authorities and by their own peers. Well, Jane's armorial heritage proved that she was well born and well connected. Now, Macquarie already knew that he was, but he didn't know how to show it yet in that kind of particularly English context. Now, when she died, too young of consumption, in Macau in China in 1796, she left Lachlan £6,000, very significant amount of money. Now, in part, and in addition to his lingering strong affection for Jane, the material outcome of her death explains his later naming of land that he acquired on the island of Mull as Jarvisfield, so after her surname, and in memory of Jane Jarvis. Now, as many of us also know, he went further and he named his first short-lived daughter by his second wife, Elizabeth Campbell of Aids. He named this daughter Jane Jarvis Macquarie. Many of us raise an eyebrow at that, of course, because this was a child by his second wife, and yet he was directly remembering his first wife. Now, that second wife, Elizabeth Campbell, was the daughter of Macleans, who were his second cousin, John Campbell of Aids. Naturally, the Laird of Aids was also armigerous. Now, this all suggests a strong consciousness on Macquarie's part of the desirability of dynastic perpetuity. In other words, giving your family something they can inherit. Now, a coat of arms is a great way to do that because it's inherently hereditable. In fact, by the time of these acts of naming and remembering Jane Jarvis, Macquarie was already using a coat of arms. By that point in his life, Macquarie had the joy of a living son, also, Lachlan Macquarie Jr. So what you're seeing here is not only a portrait of his chief, but also his chief's coat of arms. So that's significant because you're going to see the coat of arms that Macquarie ends up using, and it's startlingly similar, almost impolitely so. In January 1794, Lachlan wrote to his uncle, Murdo Maclean of Lochboy, who was actually a resident of Mull. So his uncle lived on the place that he'd been born. And he said the following, and I quote this: he asked him to get from his cousin, the chief of the clan Macquarie, as good an impression as possible from his seal on wax of my family coat of arms. To have the arms put on our chariot, by which he means his carriage, and some articles of silver plate that we have sent for from London. So he's doing all this by correspondence. Great care must be taken to make the impression on wax as plain and possible that the engraver and the painter may understand it. Indeed, if Macquarie would allow the seal itself to be sent to London, it would be the surest way of having our arms properly executed by the artist. And he might send such explanations along as it may help the production. So, far from feeling threatened or offended by any of this, the clan chief, Lachlan Macquarie, the 16th chief of Ulva, happily assisted Lochboy by referring him to a coloured version of the arms in the possession of a relation. He added that the motto is Turris Forti Mihi Deus, which in English means God is my strong tower. Although we will never know Macquarie's exact relationship to his chief, the question is rendered null and void by the fact of his chief's acknowledgement of him as a near cousin. It is clear that Macquarie's chief was highly encouraging of the idea that the successful kinsman should make use of a version of the arms, thereby adding lustre to the clan. So there's so much going on here. There's clanship. This is before the era of fixed Scottish clan tartans. And yet exactly the mindset which lies beyond all members of a surname wearing the same tartan is present here in this story. Okay, so this is a wonderful illustration of where Scotland is at in the early 1800s, before all of that Victorian romanticism of clan tartans comes into play. Now, the Macquarie chief was actually landless after the sale of Ulva in 1777. He was a bit of a wastrel. He lived a disordered life, this chief, but he was still the clan chief, and Macquarie always acknowledged that. However, this chief maintained to his dying day a great pride in his ancestry and the status as head of the ancient name and arms of Clan Macquarie. Now, our Lachlan Macquarie was one of the last members of the clan to be carrying forward any sense of pride in that clan and achieving at a very high and internationally renowned level. So that gives you some impression of why the chief was so keen for Macquarie himself to be using these arms. Upon becoming Governor of New South Wales, our Lachlan Macquarie took pride in the seal with my arms, which he carried with him and used for the rest of his life. Now, behind me here, you're seeing 4 separate productions of our Governor Macquarie's arms in use, all of them produced when he was governor here in New South Wales. In fact, most famously, the wooden version of the crest, which is the bit that goes on top of the coat of arms, is preserved at Macquarie University in the so-called Macquarie chair, which is a heavily carved big oak, I think, maybe cedar, chair that's upholstered in kangaroo hide. It's wonderfully redolent of Australia, and yet here it is stamped with Macquarie's crest on top of it. So this tells you something about the pride that Macquarie took in a coat of arms. Now, in that Jane Austen context, this is a pride in him achieving a social status. But in a Scottish context, this is him honouring his chief and his clan name and all of his clan ancestry. So there are several different parallel understandings of what's going on here. In other words, I'm at pains to say this is not snobbery, pure and simple. This is a much more complex and sophisticated thing that you're seeing happen in all of these images of Macquarie using our coat of arms. And I've called this paper Macquarie the Dynast because coats of arms are hereditary, they're inherited. And that's an important part of the story that I'm about to highlight to you. Now, when he returned to Britain from Australia in 1824, Lachlan Macquarie's reputation was under a cloud due to the negative Big Report, which was then in circulation, much to Macquarie's embarrassment. So Commissioner Big had written a report basically damning Macquarie for his level of public expenditure or his use of public funds. He saw this as being a negative, a bad, an inappropriate thing. We know that Macquarie was spending all this money to make Australia or to give Australia a future. In other words, to lay the foundations of a great nation state. So there are definitely two opinions about what Macquarie was doing with that money and his building program. Big, and a certain school of thought this was a waste of money because this was a penal colony. Why would you spend money on convicts? Of course, the other school of thought is that Macquarie was building the basis of our civilization here in Australia. And the substance of that can be seen on a walk down Macquarie Street. Okay, so the big report is unfair in many people's opinions, in fact, probably the majority, I guess, today. It was a poor time, therefore, to pursue official Crown recognition of Macquarie's achievements as governor, but that's exactly what he set out to do. And so my argument is that not only did he have a strong consciousness of where he came from in a clan sense, he also had a strong demonstrated knowledge of the importance of using a coat of arms. He also had very clear ambitions for the future, not only of himself personally, but of his family into the future. He not only wanted to do something good for Australia by that building program, he also had a personal program that was individual to his family. And that's what I'm going to tell you about now. So Macquarie particularly sought the grant of a title of nobility. That's very clear from his correspondence with Bathurst, the colonial secretary. He was desperate, in fact, for a sign of government approval, and he was safe in the knowledge that he retained some powerful supporters at court. In fact, in May 1824, Lord Bathurst, who was Secretary of State for War and for the colonies, gave Macquarie an immediate negative response to the idea of him getting a title out of the government in Britain. Macquarie did achieve a pension, and it was a big one, £1,000+ a year, which was quite significant in that era. Before anything more could be achieved, however, he died at the age of 62 in London. That's such a sad outcome, isn't it, for someone with so much energy and so much ambition. Had he gone for another 20 years, who knows what he might have achieved, not for Australia, he'd already done that part of his career, but for the Macquaries. Lachlan Macquarie's body was returned to Mull, where he had bought land, and it was laid in state in the parlour, so in the receiving room of his small cottage at Grewline, in company with the exhumed body of his daughter. Their mortal remains were accompanied by special dynastic adornments. And I'm quoting here from a description of this funeral arrangement. It says, the escutcheons, which means painted boards with their coats of arms, were placed over a tablet at the head of Macquarie's coffin. This is the sort of thing that the landed aristocracy throughout Britain were doing in this era. So here's Macquarie dying, here's Macquarie achieving very significant things in his life, and this is the end point. Okay, so this man who was born in a very poor setting, the son of a carpenter, is dying as a real Highland gentleman. I'm hoping this image is very familiar to so many of you because this is his mausoleum on Mull. The significance of the Isle of Mull demands explanation here, as it was a key component of Macquarie's plans for his future and those of his family. Lachlan Macquarie felt keenly the decline of his family's fortunes. I've already alluded to that in terms of the fate of his chief. Despite a large family spanning 2 marriages, his clan chief's large brood of male heirs had mostly died in service in the Americas during the Revolutionary Wars or in India. His last clan chief, Lachlan Macquarie, the 16th chief of Ulva, is often accused of financial mismanagement, and his Maclean relations were damning in his own lifetime in their assessment of how he'd handled his clan and his money. It's not entirely fair because Macquarie of Ulva, the clan chief, was famously visited by Dr. Johnston and Boswell during their grand tour of the Scottish Highlands, and They were well entertained, they met someone who was educated, they met someone who was hospitable, and in every way an impressive Highland chief. But they also met someone who was of a type. And the type he belonged to was a kind of chief who belonged to the past. He was not entrepreneurial. He was not a businessman. He couldn't manage lands that were profitable. He could only manage people who were clan dependents who might fight for him. This was the Scottish tradition. And Macquarie of Ulva was a very old-fashioned chief. And so, if you believe Dr. Johnson, Macquarie of Ulva belonged to another age. And he is the victim of the change into this modern era. So there's a lot that can be said in his defence. However, even his direct contemporaries, including Johnson and Boswell, who visited in 1773, saw clearly the harsh effects of the Highlands of the modern cash-based economy, combined with government restrictions on traditional Highland chiefship in the era after Culloden. Most certainly, Macquarie of Ulva was a very traditional Highland chief indeed. This all resulted in the sale of Ulva, which had been in the family for the better part of 1,000 years, and the chief living out of his days in penury. For our Lachlan, who took such pride in his ancestry and clan membership, this was a travesty. In other words, he felt a personal embarrassment and a personal responsibility in relation to the story of his chief. As their careers prospered, two junior kinsmen of the clan Macquarie, our Lachlan Macquarie and his younger brother Charles, sought to restore the landowning status of their clan. Remember that Lachlan was too distant in blood to aspire to the chiefship of the clan Macquarie, so that was never on the cards. Indeed, his landless chief not only lived to the ripe old age of 103, almost embarrassingly, he didn't die until 1807, so there was no room for anyone else to claim the chiefship, but he had a son and heir on hand in the form of young Donald Macquarie, the younger of Ulva. Instead, our Lachlan Macquarie set his sights on land that had value and meaning, not financially, but for him personally. Thus, in 1802, he finalised the purchase of part of the Duke of Argyll's property on the Isle of Mull. And at the same time, his brother Charles Macquarie, who'd also made a fortune fighting with the British East India Company in India, he bought land on Ulva itself. So two Macquarie sons of the clan made good buying back the clan patrimony. How good is that as a story? Everything should be fine. Macquarie's purchase cost him £22,000, and I emphasise this, it was £22,000 sterling, not Scots. Now that meant a great deal more, representing his entire fortune built up over his whole career of hard effort. Now this puts the big report in some context, I think, because with the big report he was using public funds, but this purchase is his own personal funds. Okay, so he's doing exactly the same thing that he was doing publicly. He's doing it personally as well. And I think that reflects a good thing, his high-mindedness about ultimate goals. What a strong indication of his depth of feeling for the clan homelands. The purchase achieved the securing of 10,000 acres. It was a fair portion of his ancient patrimonial property of the Macquaries. So within living memory of the chief losing land, they'd bought it all back. So it's back in the clan. In July 1804, Lachlan Macquarie of Ulva, the chief, and his son Donald were present at the inauguration of Lachlan Macquarie's newly purchased estate on the Isle of Mull. So that shows you how close and how affectionate those bonds are between chief and indeterminate clansmen. Major General Macquarie, our Macquarie, declared the consolidation of landholding would be called Jarvis Field, after his first wife, Jane Jarvis, in honour of his first wife. In the opinion of his second wife, Elizabeth Campbell, this is interesting, the purchase of this estate did not usher in a hopeful and prosperous future for the Macquarie bloodline. She's the sensible one, but he's the one bound by duty. Rather, she described it as being ruinous financially. Now remember, she comes from the neighbouring land. If anyone should have a strong sense of what he's doing and why he's doing it, it should be her. But she is quite critical of this action. When Macquarie's brother Charles died in 1835, the proceeds from the sale of his bit of Ulva and the bit of land that he also had on Mull went entirely towards securing his creditors. So the family lost everything. Nothing remained for his own children. Just like his cousin, the dispossessed 16th Chief of Ulva, our Lachlan Macquarie had spent money liberally, and especially during his time as Governor of New South Wales. So when he went home to Scotland, he was already in trouble via the big report for spending public money, and he was personally in trouble for spending his own money too much. His purchase of a Highland estate at such a high price thus compounded his pre-existing financial distress. Lachlan had hoped to build a castle on his lands. Who could blame him? But he had to make do with the small, pre-existing drafty dwelling that was Grueline House. Now, I'm assured that this is Grueline House as it was in Macquarie's day. This looks a bit grand, and I think that's deceptive, because what you really need to do is go to Macquarie Uni and see the reproduction of Macquarie's parlour. That means the most impressive room in his house where he would greet dignitaries who came to visit. And it's wood-lined. It's not very impressive at all for £22,000 sterling, not Scots, okay? So he's basically going back to a place after all of this effort that's little bigger than the little croft he was born in. Elizabeth Campbell's pessimism took longer to eventuate than she actually predicted, because the aspiration to revive the fortunes of Clan Macquarie did not in fact die with our governor in 1824, or in fact with the passing of his brother Charles in 1835. In fact, Lachlan Macquarie Jr., his son, was only 10 at the time of his father's death. So there is a potential future here to this story. But his subsequent life proved he had taken note of his father's inclinations in regard to dynastic ideas. He took possession of his inheritance in 1835, the year his mother died, so this is just 10 years after the governor himself. And the following year, he followed local family tradition by marrying a distant cousin, who was a Campbell, Isabella Hamilton Dundas Campbell of Jura. Now, Lachlan Macquarie Jr. died just 10 years after that, again in 1845, at the young age of 31. He was not made in the same mould as his career-driven father. We have to admit that. And even the old last clan chief of Ulva might have looked askance at the lifestyle of young Lachlan Jr. Childless, Lachlan Jr.'s death marks the actual end of all of the hopes that our governor had for the future of his clan and his own cadet branch of that clan. That's rather sad. But there's a bit of a story to tell before young Lachlan Jr. actually dies. So Lachlan Macquarie Jr. was not the last of his bloodline. In fact, he had a cousin, Charles Macquarie, who was the eldest son of his uncle Charles. This is our governor's younger brother and nephew. And he contested the will of Lachlan Jr. because Lachlan Jr. did an odd thing. When he died, he was still in possession of all of these lands on Mull that Governor Macquarie had bought. But he didn't give them to a Macquarie. He gave them to Viscount Strathallan, who was a childhood friend. This challenge to the will was unsuccessful, and the Jarvisfield estates were lost. Now, this suggests that Lachlan Jr. had little regard for his patrimony or for his father's efforts in building it all up. But I'm not sure that's true, because at some point in his brief life, Lachlan Jr. at least flirted with the idea of asserting that he was in fact the clan chief. And you're seeing the evidence of that behind me here. This is a bookplate that was in some of the books in his library in the Jarvisfield estate. And you might notice there's an odd couple of things on either side of the shield. Now, those are supporters. And in the British instance, unless you're a member of the peerage, unless you're a Knight Grand Cross of an Order of Chivalry, you don't get supporters. The only other way that you could get them is by being a Scottish clan chief. And so here he is actually using them. And even worse, they're the same supporters that Macquarie of Ulva, the actual last clan chief, did use on his coat of arms. So you see where I'm going here, don't you? Young Lachlan Jr. claimed to be Macquarie of Macquarie, the clan chief, and he even insisted that people call him that. Now, I don't think that comes out of nowhere, and I don't think that comes out of his own strange personality. I think that comes straight from Governor Macquarie, because these are the messages that he might have received, garbled, perhaps, because he was only 10 when his father died, but certainly these are the messages that he grew up with. The story doesn't end there. And one of the remarkable things about Macquarie the Dynast is that Macquarie has an ongoing resonance here in Australia that is quite beyond anything he might have expected. So remarkably, even though Macquarie's direct bloodline ended, his armorial bearings have continued to live on. No member of the Macquarie kindred ever matriculated arms with the Lord Lion King of Arms. That's the person in charge of all of the heraldry in Scotland, and he's got a lot of power. So he can make you stop using a coat of arms if you're not using it properly. He can make you stop using it if you don't have a right to it. No Macquarie ever went anywhere near this authority, like many Highland families didn't ever go near this authority. However, in 1967, our own Macquarie Uni approached the Lord Lion King of Arms and said, let's matriculate. That's the word they use. Let's matriculate. In other words, let's get on record a version of the Macquarie family arms in favour of our governor, Lachlan Macquarie. So what you're looking at is Lachlan Macquarie's coat of arms. But it's a coat of arms he never knew. It's a coat of arms he never used. It's a coat of arms that he probably would have disparaged or refused to acknowledge. Isn't that odd? So 1967, so long after his death, here he lives on. And he lives on in name in Macquarie Uni. He lives on in a real sense in the Scottish historical records, in a heraldic sense that you're seeing here. The arms recorded in 1967 are not attractive. That's a personal statement, but some of you might share it. Nor do they bear much similarity to the armorial bearings used and valued by Lachlan Macquarie during his lifetime. Remarkably, however, since 1967, Macquarie's coat of arms has taken on a life beyond its owner, and in fact a life beyond Macquarie Uni. In part, this is due to misidentification of the place of Governor Macquarie and his family. So, for example, if you look at Wikipedia, the entry misidentifies our governor as the direct son of the last chief of Ulva. That's not true, but the internet says it's true. Wikipedia even goes further and it gives an example of Lachlan's 1967 arms as being the arms of his chief. So this is really quite garbled. And it thus intrudes recently granted arms that have really no historical character to them into the history of the great clan Macquarie. That's rather odd. So behind me, the arms to the left are the ones Macquarie used in his lifetime. Very similar to his chiefs, with some subtle difference, as it should be. The arms to the right are the Macquarie University grant in memory of the governor. You can see there is actually quite a difference between them, even though they use similar elements. Now, this is not just a failing on the part of modern computing technology. In 1983, seemingly on the basis of the same 1967 matriculation by Macquarie Uni, an entirely unhistorical coat of arms was attributed to the chief of the clan Macquarie by the then Lord Lion King of Arms, a man called Sir Ian Moncrieff of that ilk, and by the heraldic artist Don Pottinger in their wall chart called Scotland of Old. Some of you, I'm sure, will own this wall chart. It has it has a big map of Scotland. It's divided up into clan homelands with the clan names on them. Around the edge, there's a bunch of coats of arms with the names of great Scottish clans and families. Well, this is the one attributed to the Macquaries. It's a complete fiction. And I can prove that because the chief never used it. You saw the chief's arms earlier on. So, to finish up, given all of this, it's actually rather pleasing that a plaque recently erected at the north end of Hyde Park in Sydney in 2013 to accompany Lachlan Macquarie's new statue accurately represents Macquarie's armorial bearings as he used them in his own lifetime. That's the copper-coloured thing you're seeing on the other side. Those are Macquarie's arms. Those are the arms he used. Those are the arms that his chief encouraged him to adopt. That's meaningful. And as a final comment, it seems fitting to display Lachlan Macquarie's full achievement of arms as he used them in his own lifetime. So just to focus on the monochrome image, I'm going to show you the colour image. So those are the arms of Lachlan Macquarie, our governor. Those are the arms of that governor encouraged for his usage by his own clan chief, who was the last chief of the Macquaries. And remember that Macquarie himself, our Macquarie, was the last notable Macquarie in his entire clan. Isn't that sad? We have the story of Macquarie, Lachlan Macquarie Jr. We've even got the story, and you can find this online, of the bloodline of his brother Charles and his descendants, because they've got an Australian story as well that gets caught up with the gold rush later on. So the Macquaries don't go away. But the whole point of this paper that I've given you tonight is an attempt really, I think, to reveal some of the thought processes of Macquarie, the psychology of Macquarie, the motivation of Macquarie, and to draw some parallels between what he actually did here in his official capacity as governor and what he was doing throughout his whole life in his capacity as a good Scottish clansman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, for tonight outlining the whole thing. And so I'd like to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to thank our speaker for his wonderful talk in the usual way.